Hello, everyone. Thank you for your interest in my talk. I'm Bhaskar Botcha, a PhD student working with Dr. Bukabhatnam at Texas A&M University. Today, we are going to talk about efficient manufacturing processes and performance qualification via active learning and an application to a cylindrical plunge grinding platform. This would be the outline of my talk. I would go about the introduction, methodology, and the experimental setup, and discuss a few results, discussion, future work, and finally conclude the talk. So the surface generation cost is a $200 billion industry. So the finishing process in any manufacturing line is considered the key value addition step as it adds the most value to any product in the manufacturing line. And typically to find out where this point lies requires high R&D costs in the back end for optimizing all these manufacturing lines and to ensure quality, repeatability, and performance. And for doing this, the process parameter to the response mapping should be known, and it's often unknown, and it is known through by doing trial and error experiments and some traditional experimental procedures. So what are the challenges here? The experimental cost involved in these procedures is often too high with traditional designs, and no single design or model can capture all these complex dynamics of a manufacturing process. So there is a need for efficient experimentation. So what we saw to is a sequential experimental design or an active learning framework where we use like multiple models to model the response surface to capture all these smooth and sharp transitions which are very typical of manufacturing processes. So the methodology, the active learning framework we employ is called a query by committee framework, where multiple models, which we call a committee, are used to model the response surface. And additional experiments are conducted sequentially, where these models predictions and response differ the most. We'll go through the details in the next few slides. So why QBC is, we know that like not all models perform the best everywhere. So each model is an expert or a subset of the sample space, and use of the QBC involves use of multiple learners or experts within the committee, which help in predicting which help in improving the overall prediction over the entire sample space. And generally, it's proven that the generalization error reduces much faster as compared to traditional experimental designs, that is exponentially. So the active learning framework, the methodology is like if suppose Pj, which is xj and yj represents an experiment, where xj is the feature vector and y is the response. So we conduct j initial experiments, capital J initial number of experiments, and we have no idea of the prior functional form of the response surface. So what we do is we consider a bunch of Gaussian process regression models and tree-based models, which are a random forest model and a cart model, the classification and regression trees. So here we see all the models and kernels used in this committee. The committee we will be calling from here on as the model bank. So we have 10 different Gaussian process regressions with different kernels. So we have exponential Mattern 3.5, Mattern 5 by 2, and squared exponential and rational quadratic. And we have an auto relevance determination determined kernel of all these, which essentially means for each vector, each feature vector, there is a scale parameter. And we also use random forest regression and regression tree. And the next step is to define the prediction deviation. So prediction deviation at any location xk is defined as the maximum deviation in the predictions yk between any pairs of competing models. So if you see here on the right, so this is the parameter index, the parameter space index, and this is the response over the entire space. So if we see here between any two pairs of competing models, this is the maximum deviation which we can see at this particular point 22. So that would be the prediction deviation at this particular location. And we define prediction deviation for each step as the maximum prediction deviation at any location. The method deviates from prediction deviation used in another paper, which we have adopted this method from. So there, the prediction deviation is considered as the deviation of weighted squared errors over different models which we are using. But here, we use a deviation metric based on the response value. So the deviation metric is based on the response value and not any of the weighted squared errors of the competing models. So we'll see later that it deals really well with outlier data points. So there's the implementation for a three-dimensional space. So all the points, we divide them into a training pool, sequential learning pool, and a testing pool. So first we train all the models. Here we have in the model bank 12 sets of models, and we find a good model at one time step. So once we find the good model, we find a subset among this model bank, which is within 95% of the confidence interval of this good model. And the next point, we find two sets of models between any two pairs of models, Fi and Fj, within this subset A. We find the prediction deviation, which we defined as the maximum deviation between any sets of models. And at all these locations, X new, which are taken from this sequential pool. So we find this particular X star, which is a point where the prediction deviation is the maximum, where X new belongs to the sequential pool X, and Fi and Fj belong to this subset A. So again, we use this test set and see if the R square has reached 85%. If we didn't, we'll go through the same sequence again. If it did, we will stop and see how many number of experimental points are in the training pool. So the experimental details of this particular cylindrical plunge grinding experiment, we use the next generation precision grinder at IIT Madras. And we use three sensors, two accelerometers, which are placed at a tangential and normal location to the tailstop, and one power sensor, which is connected to the wheel head. And we use an EN31 hardened steel and an alumina wheel for this particular experiment. So the input experimental data which we use a total of 178 experiments, a CCD with 5 factors and 3 levels. And we use 23 features. We have 3 process parameters, which are feed rate, wheel speed, and work speed, 14 time domain features, which we extract from the signals, and 6 frequency domain features. Now, the feature extraction routine is discussed in one of our previous works, which is published in Procedia. And there we have reported an accuracy of around 85% with 178 experiments. So what we want to see in this study is it's a retroactive study. The experiments have already been done. So we want to see if a sequential design can reduce the experimental cost in total. So these are the results where we started off with 20, 35, 50, and 65 initial number of points. And we let the sequential experimental design run and see where the model converges to 85% prediction accuracy. So as reported earlier, the best prediction accuracy for considering all data points is 85%, which is a random forest model. With this particular design, we could attain an prediction accuracy of 85% with 65% reduction in experimental costs, and at least 50% reduction in experimental costs, which is huge for any manufacturing lines. And one more result here, we compare our algorithm with a traditional experimental design. So here what we see is all the light blue lines here are different realizations of a sequential experimental run. So we started 35 experiments and see until like around 100 experiments where the R square value goes. And for the same sets of experiments, here the box plots here at 45, 60, 75, 90 are random designs, like 10 experiments each and of a central composite design. And we find the R square value. Here we can see that our sequential experimental design consistently performs better than any of the runs using central composite design. So that ensures that our model is better than random experimentation or traditional experiments. And one more discussion point is the effect of initial data set. So here we see starting with 20 initial experiments, the total number of experiments to reach R square of 85 on an average was around 74. And for 70 experiments, initial experiments, we see that it is 100. So what we are seeing here is if we are using just few initial data points, which are of lower quality, and we let the sequential design do our work for us of picking up points sequentially, which add most value to building the building the response surface. So what we see is even if we start with less number of data points, we reach an R square of 85 much faster as compared to using a lot of experiments, which are not chosen judiciously and ending up with a lot more number of experiments. So this is the quality versus quantity of data which we would like to show as part of the study. Essentially means that we can use low quality, less number of experiments to start with, and let the sequential experimental design do its work. And some more discussion. So we have included some outlier data points into this data set to see how the models perform when there are extreme points. So here we have included a work speed of 400 meter per second, which is outside the design space. And the effect of one bad model kind of plunges this R square value much below. But we can see that as an effect of, as there is a committee of learners, the model immediately picks up and the R square kind of is on its normal trajectory. So this is one of the benefits of using learning with a committee. And the combination of spline and tree based models also helps capture the non-stationary trends. And as part of a future work, we would like to do a detailed analysis on the performance of each of these models in the subset of the parameter space and understand why different models work well in different subspaces of the parameter space. Because as we mentioned earlier, the primary reason we are using a committee is because uh, we hypothesize that different models work differently at different regions of the parameter space. We want to understand why this is happening and what models can perform better at what subregions of the space. And we also would like to study if there exists like better metrics or a combination of metrics other than prediction deviation or including prediction deviation, which works best for manufacturing applications. In summary, like we have demonstrated a QBC-based approach for active experimentation, and it proved to be economical, showing a 50 to 65% reduction in experimental cost. And the model can capture both smooth and sharp transitions typical of a manufacturing process. And we also discussed that the quality of an experimental data point is more important than quantity. And the quality is ensured by using a sequential experimental design. The limitations of this particular work, we have tried it with a slightly different application, and we saw that no fixed committee works for all applications. So there needs to be some initial uh, research on what committee works best. And the quality of the initial data set also affects the total number of experiments vastly. And I look forward to that concludes my talk. And I look forward to the live Q&A session at the end of the session. Thank you.